Good morning, everyone. Today is the week 8th of our semester. So we are halfway through this semester and we are going to talk about the environmental health and toxicology, which is the chapter 8 of our course. After studying this chapter, you should be able to answer the following questions like what is environmental health and what health risks should worry us most. We will talk about the emergent diseases that seem to be more frequent now. One of the examples is the current COVID-19. What human factors that may be involved in this trend, and are there any connections between ecology and our health? What makes some chemicals dangerous and others harmless? And we will also talk about how much risk is acceptable and to whom. Let's start with the case study that how dangerous our BPA is. BPA, which means the bisphenol A, which is a key ingredient of both polycarbonate plastics and epoxy resins. It's one of the most widely used chemical compounds. In 2011, total global production was about 3 million metric tons, and the chemical industry expects the use to double by 2015 because the China and other developing countries they manufacture increasing amounts of plastics or plastic coated wares. BPA, which means the bisphenol A, is used in items ranging from the baby bottles, automobile headlights, eyeglass lenses, CDs, DVDs, water pipes, the linings of cans and bottles, and also the protecting sealants. Traces of this bisphenol A are found in humans nearly everywhere. So, in one study of several thousand ordinary American adults, it has been found that 95% had measurable amounts of this chemical in their bodies. The most likely source of contamination is mainly from the food and the beverage containers. How dangerous is this bisphenol A? In recent years, dozens of scientists around the world have linked this BPA to myriad health effects in rodents, including the mammary and prostate cancer, genital defects in males, early onset of puberty in females, obesity, and even behavioral problems such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Furthermore, various epidemiological studies in humans they show a correlation between the urine concentrations of BPA and the cardiovascular disease, also the type 2 diabetes and liver enzyme abnormalities. Scientists find that BPA, like the phthalates, dioxins, and PCBs, they act as an endocrine hormone disruptor. But rodents, especially those that are raised in the lab conditions, may not be accurate models for how humans react in the real world to this BPA. Cross-sectional or studies of human populations show only correlations but not any casualties. BPA can leach into food from many sources. Canada, Japan, and most European countries, they have restricted the use of this chemical in most consumer applications. In 2012, the United States Food and Drug Administration banned this BPA in bottles, in the baby bottles, in children's drinking cups, but it didn't extend the ruling to other food and beverage containers. Industry representatives they emphasize the scientific uncertainty and the need for further research, while most scientists and some consumer groups they demand a more comprehensive ban. This case study introduces a number of important themes for this chapter. So, how dangerous or low level but widespread exposures to a variety of environmental toxins? What are the effects of disruption of endocrine systems by synthetic or natural compounds? And how should we test and evaluate these toxic substances? We will talk about all these questions in our coming up slides. Talking about the environmental health, health by definition, we are all ill to some extent. Likewise, we all can improve our health to live happier, longer, more productive, or more satisfying lives if we think about what we do. Diet and nutrition, infectious agents, toxic substances, genetics, trauma, or stress, they all play a role in the morbidity and mortality. Morbidity means the illness, and mortality means the death. The World Health Organization estimates that 24% of all global disease burden and 23% of premature mortality due to environmental factors. Among children 0 to 14 years, it has been found that the deaths attributable to environmental factors may be as high as 36%. One more thing I want to mention here is that when we talk about a disease, it's an abnormal change in the body's condition that impairs or affects its important physical or psychological functions. Main sources of environmental health risks are the infectious agents, the bacteria, protozoan, some kind of trauma, accidents, the chemicals from the industries like lead, toxins, smoking, ultraviolet radiations, or ionizing. So these are some kind of environmental health risks, the major sources of environmental health risks. Also the air pollution, noise pollution, or water pollution. Talking about the global disease burden, which is changing, in the past, the health organizations, they have focused on the leading causes of death as the best summary of world health. Mortality data, however, fail to capture the impacts of non-fatal outcomes of disease and injury, such as dementia or blindness, on human well-being. When people are ill, work isn't done, crops are not planted or harvested, the meals are not cooked, and children can't study and learn. Health agencies now calculate the disability adjusted life years, that's the DALYS, disability adjusted life years, as a measure of disease burden. These disability adjusted life years, they combine the premature deaths and loss of a healthy life resulting from illness or disability. This is an attempt to evaluate the total cost of disease, not simply how many people die. The world is now undergoing a dramatic epidemiological transition. Chronic conditions such as cardiovascular disease and cancer no longer affect only wealthy people. Marvelous progress in eliminating the communicable diseases such as the smallpox, polio, malaria, they are allowing people nearly everywhere to live longer. There are certain emergent and infectious diseases that kill millions of people. Communicable diseases are still responsible for about one third of all disease related mortality. Leading causes of these global disease burden are pneumonia, it leads to heart diseases, diarrhea, the perinatal conditions because of the traffic accidents, and the heart diseases, stroke, tuberculosis, measles, traffic accidents, birth defects, the chronic lung diseases, malaria, iron anemia, or malnutrition. These are the leading causes of these global disease burden in 1990. So nowadays, in 2020, you will see the heart disease, it ranks the number one, and then there are certain depressions and traffic accidents, it leads that ranks the number three. Emergent and infectious diseases, they still kill millions of people. Although the ills of modern life have become the leading killers almost everywhere in the world, these communicable diseases still are responsible for about one third of all disease-related mortality. Diarrhea, acute respiratory illness, malaria, measles, tetanus, and other infectious diseases, they kill about 11 million children every year in the developing world. Better nutrition, clean water, improved sanitation, and inexpensive inoculations, they could eliminate most of these deaths. Talking about the emergent diseases, these are those not previously known or that have been absent for at least 20 years. So, an increasing number of these epidemics have been popping up in recent years as the global population has grown and become increasingly interconnected. The 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, it illustrates how rapidly the infectious diseases can spread and dangers of lax oversight. Ebola, which is a hemorrhagic fever caused by a filovirus, it causes a high fever, diarrhea followed by acute hemorrhage. It's highly fatal for apes, monkeys, and humans. At least 24 Ebola outbreaks have occurred across Central Africa since it was first described in 1976. At least 3 million children they die every year from easily preventable diseases. You can see this billboard in Guatemala. It encourages the parents to have their children vaccinated uh, against the polio, diphtheria, TB, tetanus, pertussis, that's the whooping cough, and scarlet fever. It has been found that every year there are 76 million cases of foodborne illness in the United States, resulting in a 300,000 hospitalizations and 5,000 deaths. Talking about the pathogens, they are the disease causing organisms. Epidemiologists now estimate that at least one third of all humans living at the time were infected and that between 50 to 100 million died. Business, schools, churches, and sport and entertainment events, they were shut down for months. There were worries that H1N1 pandemic that spread around the world in 2009 might sicken 2 billion people and kill up to 150 million and bring the world economy to a standstill. Fortunately, it has not been nearly as bad so far as 1918 strain. That's the influenza, which was caused by a family of viruses that mutate rapidly and move from the wild and domestic animals to humans, making control of this disease very difficult. And unfortunately, right now also we are facing the uh, COVID-19 pandemic. So it's not that bad. That was in 1918, but still it has caused a lot of loss in economy and it has put all the economy to a standstill, and a lot of people they have lost their lives, and many of us have uh, also lost our loved ones. So these diseases are actually the emergent diseases. The COVID-19 is also one of the emergent diseases. Similarly, cholera, which had been absent from South America for more than a century, re-emerged in Peru in 1992. Some other examples include a new drug-resistant form of tuberculosis, now spreading in South Africa, dengue fever, which is spreading through Southeast Asia and Caribbean, and a new human lymphotropic virus, which is thought to have jumped from monkeys into the people to Cameroon who handled or ate the bushmeat. These HTLV strains are now thought to infect 25 million people. West Nile, which belongs to a family of mosquito-transmitted viruses, cause encephalitis, that's the brain inflammation. Although recognized in Africa in 1937, the West Nile virus was absent from North America until 1999, when it apparently was introduced by an imported bird or mosquito. The disease spread rapidly from New York, where it was first reported, throughout the eastern United States in only 2 years. Within 5 years, it was found almost everywhere in the lower 48 states. The virus infects at least 250 bird species and 18 mammalian species. The spread of this West Nile virus has been found that about 4,000 people contracted this West Nile and about 100 died. Humans are not the only ones to suffer from new and devastating diseases. There are certain domestic animals and wildlife. They also experience the sudden and widespread epidemics, which are sometimes called the ecological diseases. We are coming to recognize that the delicate ecological balances that we value so highly and disrupt so frequently are important to our own health. Conservation medicine is an emerging discipline that attempts to understand that how our economic environmental changes they threaten our own health as well as that of the natural communities that we depend upon for our ecological services. Although it is still small, this new field is gaining recognition from mainstream funding sources such as the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the US National Institute of Health. Ebola hemorrhagic fever, for example, is one of the most virulent viruses ever known, killing up to 90% of its victims. In 2002, an outbreak of this Ebola fever began killing humans along the Gabon-Congo border. A few months later, researchers found that 221 or 235 western lowland gorillas they had been studying in this area disappeared in just a few months. Many chimpanzees also died. So, although the study team could find only a few of dead gorillas, 70% of those tested positive for Ebola. So altogether, the researchers they estimate that about 5,000 gorillas died in this small area of Congo. Frogs and toads they are also succumbing to a deadly disease. An even more widespread epidemic is currently sweeping through amphibians. So a disease called chytridiomycosis is causing dramatic losses or even extinction of frogs and toads throughout the world. A fungus called Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis. It causes a disease which was first recognized in 1993 in the dead and dying frogs in Queensland, Australia. And now it's spreading very rapidly, perhaps because the fungus has become more virulent or amphibians are more susceptible due to environmental change. Resistance to antibiotics and pesticides is also increasing. Staphylococcus is a very common, most people have at least some of these bacteria. They are a common cause of sore throats and skin infections, but are usually easily controlled. This new strain, however, is resistant to penicillin and related antibiotics, and they can cause deadly infections, especially in people with the weak immune system. MRSA, which means the methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, is most frequent in hospitals, nursing homes, correctional facilities, and other places where the people are in close contact. It's generally spread through the direct skin contact. School locker rooms, gymnasiums, and contact sports are also sources of infection. Several states have closed schools as a result of this MRSA, the methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. In 2006, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimated that at least 100,000 MRSA infections in the United States resulted in about 19,000 deaths. Why have vectors such as the mosquitoes and pathogens such as bacteria or malarial parasite they become resistant to pesticides and antibiotics? Part of the answer is the natural selection and the ability of many organisms to evolve rapidly. Another factor might be the human tendency to use control measures carelessly. Many doctors they prescribe the penicillin and other antibiotics just in case they might do some good. Similarly, when we discovered the DDT and other insecticides, they could control mosquito populations. We spread them everywhere. This has not only harmed the wildlife and beneficial insects, but also created perfect conditions for natural selection. There are certain random mutations that make a few cells resistant when changed by the antibiotics. Only those cells survive to give rise to a resistant colony. In the figure B, you can see here that sexual reproduction, that's the conjugation or plasmid transfer, moves genes from one strain to another, forming the harmful drug-resistant bacterium, and these then form a resistant colonies. Who should pay for these healthcare? That means the World Health Organization estimates that 90% of all disease burden occurs in developing countries, where less than one-tenth of all healthcare dollars is spent. The group Medicine Sans Frontiers, that's the MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, call this the 1090 gap. That means there's Dr. Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University Earth Institute says that disease is as much as a cause of consequence of poverty and political unrest. More charities in the wealthy countries such as Gates Foundation need to step up and help eradicate diseases in the developing countries. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, it has pledged $200 million for medical aid to developing countries to help fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Talking about the toxicology, we all know that toxic means poisonous. In addition to studying the agents that cause toxicity, scientists in this field are concerned with movement and fate of poisons in the environment, or they also study the routes of entry into the body and effects of exposure to these agents. Toxic substances, they damage or kill the living organisms because they react with cellular components to disrupt the metabolic functions. Toxins often are harmful even in extremely dilute concentrations. In some cases, billionth or even trillionths of a gram can cause irreversible damage. Environmental toxicology or ecotoxicology specifically deals with the interactions, transformation, fate, and effects of toxic materials in the biosphere, including the individual organisms, their populations, and whole ecosystem. In aquatic systems, the fate of the pollutants is primarily studied in relation to mechanisms and processes of interfaces of the ecosystem components. Special attention is devoted to the sediment water or water organisms and water air interfaces. In terrestrial environments, the emphasis tends to be on effects of metals on soil fauna community. That means the soil microbial community and the population characteristics. How do toxins affect us? Allergens are the substances that activate the immune system. Some allergens they act directly as antigens. What does antigen actually mean? These are the substances, for example, the pollens, bacteria, etc. They recognized as the foreign by white blood cells and stimulate the production of specific antibodies. And antibodies are proteins that are produced by our bodies that recognize and bind to those foreign cells or the chemicals. Some people suffer from what is called the sick buildings syndrome. That's the headaches, allergies, and chronic fatigue, which are caused by poorly vented indoor air that's contaminated by the molds, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, formaldehyde, and other toxic chemicals that are released in our daily life by carpets, insulations, plastics, building materials, and other sources. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates that poor indoor air quality may cost the nation $60 billion in a year and reduce productivity. Neurotoxins are a special class of metabolic poisons that specifically attack the nerve cells, that's the neurons. The nervous system is so important in regulating the body activities that disruption of its activities is especially fast acting and devastating. We have different types of neurotoxins that act in different ways. Heavy metals such as lead and mercury, they kill the nerve cells and they can cause permanent neurological damage. Anesthetics, for example, we have the ether, chloroform, halothane, etc., and chlorinated hydrocarbons like the DDTs, dieldrin, aldrin. They disrupt the nerve cell membranes that are necessary for nerve action. We have certain organophosphates like malathion, parathion, and carbamates like carbaryl, xanap, manap that inhibit the acetyl cholinesterase and enzyme that regulates the signal transmission between the nerve cells and the tissues or organs they uh, interact with. Most neurotoxins are both acute and extremely toxic. So, more than 850 compounds are now recognized as the neurotoxins. Talking about the mutagens, these are the agents that, such as chemicals and radiation that damage or alter the genetic material, that's the DNA in the cells. This can lead to birth defects if the damage occurs during the embryonic or fetal growth. Later in life, the genetic damage may trigger the neoplastic or some tumor growth. When the damage occurs in the reproductive cells, the results can be passed on to the future generations. Talking about the teratogens, these are the chemicals or the factors that specifically cause the abnormalities during the embryonic growth development. The most prevalent teratogen in the world is alcohol. Drinking during pregnancy can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome. A cluster of symptoms include the craniofacial abnormalities, the developmental delays, behavioral problems, and mental defects that last throughout a child's life. Even one alcoholic drink a day during pregnancy has been associated with decreased birth weight. Lastly, let's talk about the carcinogens. These are the substances that cause cancer. Cancer rates rose in most industrialized countries during the 20th century, and cancer is now the second leading cause of death in the United States, which kills about 500,000 people every year. 16 of the 20 compounds that are listed by United States Environmental Protection Agency as the greatest risk to human health are probably or possible human carcinogens. One of the most recently recognized environmental health threats are the endocrine hormone disruptors. These are the chemicals that actually interrupt the normal endocrine hormone functions. The hormones or the chemicals released into the bloodstream by our glands in one part of the body to regulate the development and function of tissues and organs elsewhere in the body. You might have heard that about sex hormones and their powerful effects on how we look and behave, but these are only one example of many regulatory hormones that rule our lives. We now know that some of the most effects of persistent chemicals such as bisphenol A or DDT or PCBs are that they interfere with the normal growth, development, and physiology of a variety of animals. In some cases, the picogram of concentration, that's the trillionths of a gram per liter, may be enough to cause developmental abnormalities in sensitive organisms. These chemicals are sometimes called environmental estrogens or androgens because they cause the sexual dysfunction, that's the reproductive health problems in females or feminization of males, for example. They are just as likely to disrupt the thyroxine functions or those or other important regulatory molecules as they obstruct the sex hormones. Steroid hormone action, talking about that, the plasma hormone carriers, they deliver the regulatory molecules to the cell surface where they cross the cell membrane. Intracellular receptors, they deliver hormones to the nucleus where they bind to and regulate the expression of DNA. Estrogen like compounds, they bind to these receptors and they either block the uptake of endogenous hormones or act as a substitute hormone. What they did because of this is that when they act as a substitute hormone, they disrupt the gene expression. Let's now talk about the solubility and mobility that determine when and where the chemicals move. Water-soluble compounds, they tend to have ready access to most cells in the body because aqueous solutions, they bath all our cells. Once inside our body, however, oil-soluble toxics, they penetrate readily into tissues and cells because the membrane that enclose cells are themselves made of oil-soluble chemicals. Once inside the cells, the oil-soluble materials are likely to accumulate and they can be stored in the lipid deposits where they may be protected from metabolic breakdown and persist for many years. Exposure and susceptibility can determine how we respond. There are many routes for toxins to enter our bodies. Condition of the organism and timing of exposure, they also have strong influence on toxicity. Healthy adults, for example, may be relatively insensitive to doses that are very dangerous to young children or to someone already that's weakened by other diseases. Children drink more water, eat more food, and breathe more air than do adults. Putting fingers, toys, and other objects into their mouth, they increase children's exposure to toxins in dust or soil. Furthermore, children have less developed immune system or processes to degrade or excrete these toxins. The developing brain is especially sensitive to damage. Obviously, it disrupts the complex and sensitive processes of brain growth and development and can have tragic long term consequences. Researchers estimate that in 1 in 6 children in America has a developmental disability, usually involving the nervous system. Lead is the most common toxin in children. Bioaccumulation, which refers to the fact that organisms may selectively absorb and more toxins in their bodies. Cells have this mechanism for bioaccumulation, that's the selective absorption and storage of a great variety of molecules. What is the function of this bioaccumulation is that it allows them to accumulate the nutrients and essential minerals, but at the same time, they also may absorb and store some harmful substances through the same mechanism. That's the bioaccumulation. Materials that are rather dilute in the environment, they can reach dangerous levels inside cells and tissues through this process of bioaccumulation. We have certain toxic substances that can be magnified through the food webs. Biomagnification, on the other hand, occurs when the toxic burden of a large number of organisms at a lower trophic level is accumulated and concentrated by a predator in a higher trophic level. We have certain phytoplanktons and bacteria in aquatic systems, for example, that take up heavy metals or toxic organic molecules from water or sediments. They are predators, that's the zooplankton and the small fish. They collect and retain the toxins from many prey organisms, building up higher concentration of these toxics. The top carnivores in the food chain, for example, have some game fish, the fish-eating birds, and humans. They can accumulate such high toxic levels that they suffer adverse health complications. It has been found that certain heavy metals such as lead and mercury, they are classic examples. Mercury, like lead, can destroy nerve cells and is particularly dangerous to children. The largest source of mercury in the United States is from burning coal. Every year, there are certain power plants in the United States that release about 48 tons of this toxic metal into the air. It works its way through food chains and is concentrated to dangerous levels in the fish. Mercury contamination is the most common cause of lakes and rivers failing to meet the pollution regulation standards. Many organic compounds such as polyvinyl chloride, plastics, and chlorinated hydrocarbons, pesticides, they are highly resistant to degradation. Chemical interactions, they can increase the toxicity. There are some materials that produce the antagonistic reactions. That's they interfere with the effects or stimulate the breakdown of other chemicals. For instance, the vitamin E and A that can reduce the response to some carcinogens, other materials, or additive when they occur together in exposures. For example, we have rats that are exposed to both lead and arsenic. They show twice the toxicity of only one of these elements. Perhaps the greatest concern is the synergistic effect. Synergism is an interaction in which one substance exaggerates the effects of another. For example, occupational asbestos exposure increases the lung cancer rates 20 times. Smoking increases lung cancer rates by the same amount. Asbestos workers who also smoke, however, have a 400 times increase in cancer rates. How many other toxic chemicals are we exposed to that are below threshold limits individually but combined to give toxic results? Talking about the mechanisms for minimizing the toxic effects, we all know that each of us consume lethal doses of many chemicals over the course of a lifetime. A fundamental concept in toxicology is that every material can be poisonous under some conditions, but most chemicals have a safe level or threshold below which their effects are undetectable or insignificant. Each of us consumes these lethal doses of many chemicals over the course of a lifetime. 100 cups of strong coffee, for instance, it contains a lethal dose of caffeine. Similarly, 100 aspirin tablets or 10 kg of spinach or a liter of alcohol could be deadly if consumed all at once. So, taken in small doses, however, these materials can be broken down or excreted before they do much harm. Furthermore, the damage they cause can be repaired. Let's now talk about the metabolic degradation and excretion, how they can eliminate the toxins. Volatile molecules such as carbon dioxide, hydrogen cyanide, and ketones are excreted via breathing. There are some excess salts and other substances that are excreted in sweat. Primarily, however, excretion is a function of kidneys, which can eliminate significant amounts of soluble materials through urine formation. In mammals, most of these enzymes are located in the liver, the primary site of detoxification of both natural wastes and introduced poisons. Repair mechanisms can mend the damage in the same way that individual cells have enzymes to repair damage to DNA. The protein at the molecular level, tissues and organs are exposed regularly to physical wear and tear or to toxic or hazardous materials. They often have mechanisms for damage repair. Our skin and epithelial linings of gastrointestinal tract, blood vessels, lungs, and urogenital systems, they have high cellular reproduction rates to replace the injured cells. The dose makes the poison. This means that almost everything is toxic at very high levels, but can be safe if diluted enough. Sodium chloride, that's the table salt, for instance, is essential for human life in small doses. If you were forced to eat a kilogram of salt all at once, however, it would make you very sick. A similar amount injected into your bloodstream would be lethal. So, how a material is delivered and what rate it plays a wider role in determining the toxicity. The most commonly used and widely accepted toxicity test is to expose a population of lab animals to major doses of a specific substance under the controlled conditions. This procedure is expensive, it's time consuming, and often painful and debilitating to the animals that are being tested. It commonly takes hundreds or even thousands of animals, several years of hard work, and hundreds of thousands of dollars to thoroughly test the effects of a toxic element at very low doses. More human toxicity tests using computer simulations of model reactions, cell cultures, and other substitutes for whole living animals are being developed. One problem is the differences in toxic sensitivity among the members of a specific population. Figure 8.13, you can see here, it shows you a typical dose or response curve for exposure to a hypothetical chemical. Some individuals are very sensitive to the material, while as others are insensitive. Most, however, fall in a middle category, forming a bell-shaped curve. The question for regulators and politicians is whether we should set population levels that will protect everyone. Dose or response curve are not always symmetrical, making it difficult to compare toxicity of unlike chemicals or different species of organisms. A convenient way to describe the toxicity of a chemical is to determine the dose to which the 50% of animals or test population is sensitive. So in the case of a lethal dose, this is called the LD50. That means the 50% of the test population that were sensitive to this dose. So this dose is called the LD50. Very toxic materials take about one-tenth of that amount, while extremely poisonous materials they take 100th as much, only a few drops to kill most of the people. Super toxic chemicals are extremely potent. For some, a few micrograms, that means the millionth of a gram, an amount invisible to the naked eye, can be lethal dose. These materials are not all synthetic. One of the most toxic chemicals known, for instance, is the ricin, a protein that's found in castor bean seeds. It's so poisonous that it has been found that zero point 0.3 billionth of a gram, if it is given intravenously, will kill a mouse. If aspirin were this toxic for humans, a single tablet divided evenly could kill 1 million people. Toxins can have some acute or chronic doses and effects. Most of the toxic effects that we have discussed so far have been very acute effects. That's they are caused by single exposure to the threat and result in an immediate health crisis. Often, if the individual experiencing an acute reaction survives this crisis, the effects are reversible. Talking about the chronic effects, they, on the other hand, are long lasting, perhaps even permanent. A chronic effect can result from a single dose of a very toxic substance, or it can be the result of a continuous or repeated sublethal exposure. Unlike the acute effects, it's usually difficult to assess the specific health risks of chronic exposures because other factors such as aging, normal diseases, they act simultaneously with the factor that's under study. It often requires very large population of experimental animals to obtain significant results for low-level chronic exposures. Noxious materials that may seem to be more widespread now than in the past is surely a valid perception for many substances. The daily reports that we hear of new chemicals that were found in new places, however, are also due in part to our most sensitive measuring techniques. 20 years ago, parts per million were generally the limit of detection for most materials. Anything below that amount was often reported as zero or absent, rather than more accurately as undetected. A decade ago, new machines and techniques were developed to measure parts per billion. Suddenly, the substances were found where none had been suspected. Now we can detect parts per trillion or even parts per quadrillion in some cases. Increasingly, the sophisticated measuring capabilities may lead us to believe that toxic materials have become more prevalent. In fact, our environment may be more dangerous. We are just better at finding those trace elements. Low doses can have variable effects. Very low amounts of radiation seem to be protective against certain cancers. This is perplexing because ionizing radiation has been recognized as a human carcinogen. It's thought now that, however, they were very low radiations, the exposure may stimulate the DNA, that's the deoxyribose nucleic acid repair along the enzymes that destroy the free radicals, that's the atoms with unpaired reactive electrons in their outer shells. So activating these repair mechanisms may defend us from others. These nonlinear effects are called as hormesis. As we have already seen that many factors they complicate the movement and fate of chemicals both around us and within our bodies. Furthermore, the public perception of relative dangers from environmental hazards can be skewed so that some risks seem to be much more important. than others. Talking about the risk, which is the probability of harm times the probability of exposure if that chemical is released into the environment. What's our perception of risks? Is it always rational? A number of factors influence how we perceive these relative risks associated with different situations. Our personal experiences, they are often misleading when we have not personally experienced a bad outcome. We feel it's more rare and unlikely to occur than it actually may be. So, how much risk is actually acceptable? How much is it worth to minimize and avoid the exposure to certain risks? Most people, they will tolerate a high probability of occurrence of an event if the harm caused by that event is low. Conversely, harm of greater severity is acceptable only at low levels of frequency. The Environmental Protection Agency generally assumes that a risk of about 1 in 1 million is acceptable for most environmental hazards. For activities that we enjoy, we are often willing to accept that far greater risks than this general threshold. Conversely, we can say that for the risks that benefit someone else, we demand far higher protection. For instance, your chance of dying in a motor vehicle accident in any given year are about 1 in 5,000. But that doesn't mean that many people from riding in automobiles. That means your chances of dying from lung cancer if you smoke one pack of cigarettes per day are about 1 in 1,000. By comparison, the risk from drinking water with the EPA limit of uh, trichloroethylene is about 2 in 1 billion. Strangely, many people demand water with zero levels of this trichloroethylene while continuing to smoke cigarettes. The biggest problem in making regulatory decisions is that we are usually exposed to many sources of harm, often unknowingly. It's difficult to separate the effects of these hazards and to evaluate their risks accurately, especially when the exposures are near the threshold of measurement and response. In spite of often vague and contradictory data, public policy makers they must make some decisions. So, concluding our chapter, we talked about that we have made marvelous progress in reducing some of the worst diseases that have long plagued the humans. And also, however, the chronic conditions they once were confined to richer countries have now become leading health problems nearly everywhere. New emergent diseases like we have a great example right now, the COVID-19, they are appearing at an increasing rate. With increase in international travel, diseases can spread around the globe in a few days. In addition, the modern industry is introducing thousands of new chemicals every year, most of which are not studied thoroughly for long term health effects. That was all about today's chapter. Thank you.